Hey there, this is Daniel. Welcome to Flying Chariots The Rise. Guys, unfortunately, my wonderful colleague Dustin can't be here with us today. But hey, Dustin, if you're listening to this, peace and love, and I hope you're doing well. Our guest today is Chris Aubeck. Aubeck was born in London, and his interest in unexplained aerial phenomena began very early. He has helped compile the world's largest collection of UFO cases from before 1947, which is very impressive. A few years back, he wrote a book together with researcher Jaques Vallee. It's called Wonders in the Sky. But today he's here to tell us about his latest book, Alien Artifacts, the forgotten story of how we came to believe in visitors from the stars. With this book, he wants not only to entertain but also make people think. He wants us to think seriously about what we read and perhaps break through traditional thought patterns. If you're interested in buying this book, you will find a link in the description. And guys, if you like today's episode, please leave us a like and a subscription, and share your thoughts with us in the comment section. You can also find Flying Chariots The Rise on Spotify. Okay, Chris. First of all, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. My wonderful colleague Dustin can't be with us this time. To my shame, I must confess that I only recently came across you. And so I found your book on Amazon. It's called Alien Artifacts, the forgotten story of how we came to believe in visitors from the stars. I found this an interesting read and felt the need to introduce this great book to our viewers and listeners. But let's start with you. If you don't mind, please tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into all of this.
Okay, great. Well, when I was about 14, 15, possibly even 13 years old, I started reading books by Eric von Däniken, whose paperbacks just kept popping up amongst the Marvel comics I was buying at a local secondhand market in London. And I found them very interesting because, of course, it was like halfway between the science fiction that I was reading in my Marvel comics and science fact. And he had photographs in the middle of his paperback books to prove it, although most of them just sort of kept coming loose and I ended up losing most of those photos. But still, after that, I started getting interested in mythology and folklore because it seemed like a logical next step because, of course, in the ancient astronaut or ancient aliens hypothesis, people would well, the idea is that for thousands of years we were being visited by beings from other planets. So they would not only have left a tangible trace in the archaeological record, but also on our collective consciousness in the form of folklore and stories. So when I was 15, 16 years old, I would sometimes not go to class at school, and I'd end up sitting in the university library with a briefcase full of pens and paper and books and whatever, researching ancient mythology. And that was probably around the year 1986. Then I was a member of the Ancient Astronaut Society, which was organized by Gene Phillips, who was Eric von Däniken's lawyer. At that time, he lived in Illinois, so the headquarters of this society was in Illinois. And I started to send letters to all of the writers who appeared in the monthly, I think it was bi-monthly bulletin, Ancient Skies. So I became friendly with a lot of authors in that period, quite well-known ones, and others much more obscure. One of them, for example, the UK writer Walter Raymond Drake, W. Raymond Drake, who published a very long series of books called Gods and Spacemen, Gods and Spacemen in the East, Gods and Spacemen in the West, Gods and Spacemen in Israel, and so on. And I used to call him on the phone. I don't think he ever realized I was only about 16 years old. And by the year 1990, I found myself in America visiting these people, aged 18, and I realized that there was a lot of work to do. But of course, the internet didn't exist at that time, and I had to wait another 10 years before I could found a group called Magonia Exchange, which is a historical archival group. What we do is amass as many cuttings as possible from the 19th, 18th, 17th century, from newspapers, books in all languages, including German, and try to find patterns in the data. We focus on UFO reports, but also a lot of other Fortean accounts of absolutely every kind, from ghosts to fish falls, because you never know what might be connected. And that's been going on for 20 years now. And over the years, we've collected more than 50,000, 60,000 cuttings. And I've spent the last decade going over them, trying to work out what they mean and see if I can find connections between the stories, and also to work out what's true and what's not. Because just because I'm interested in all of this, it doesn't mean I believe everything is real. But my approach is to look at it as you would, as someone interested in literature would. If you're interested in medieval literature, you might accept to a certain extent that certain events are completely real, but you don't have to believe in the existence of Romeo and Juliet for it to be interesting for you. Anyway, then I wrote a book with Jaques Vallee, the French astronomer, and that was called Wonders in the Sky in the year 2010. And that helped me get more exposed to the UFO community at large. And since then, I've been working on so many other projects. Now I'm publishing books in English and in Spanish simultaneously, because I live in Spain.
Thank you. You started pretty young. It all started with Eric von Däniken. Heard that before many times.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Times. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know whether it's because von Däniken's theories appeal to young people, because they're very simple. The idea that the gods were astronauts, it's a very simple idea. It has more complex ramifications and layers, but it's a very simple thought that you can cut through so much mysticism and theology and just say the chariots of fire were actually spaceships, and that's all. It's a very reductionist view, I think. It's a way to reduce a lot of noise to a very basic idea that appeals to any young man interested in Marvel comics.
Yeah. How did you get to know Jaques Vallee? He's a very interesting guy too. I really like his work.
Mm-hmm. Well, the first ever email that I sent in my life was in 1997, and I was teaching some computer teachers in Cáceres in Spain at the Polytechnic, and they said, "Hey, this is the internet. This is a computer." I'd never actually used a computer before, in fact, and my first instinct was to just look for Jaques Vallee, because I knew that he was a computer expert, engineer or technician or whatever he was. And I thought maybe I could find his email address online, which is a very innocent thought, because these days most people keep their email addresses hidden. But I found it, and I wrote to him, I believe it was in March 1997. And then I didn't see a computer again for about 5 months, at which point I could see his reply in the account that I'd made. And after that, we just talked a lot about how we could collaborate on a project relating to historical UFOs at some time in the future. Then in the year 2003, I went to meet him personally in Portugal, in Porto, during a conference there. And it was very nice. I met him and I spent time with him and his wife, Janine, who died a few years ago too, unfortunately. And but anyway, we're still good friends, Jaques and I, and we talk frequently. And yeah, it's an interesting. We've had an interesting partnership in that sense.
Mm. I'm a little bit jealous. I would love to talk to Jacques Vallee someday, but maybe
I can call him if you want. You can give him a.
Let's talk about this one later.
Okay.
Yeah. Since you live in Spain, are there any UFO reports coming from Spain? Some sightings, interesting stuff like that?
Yeah, there are still UFO reports being sort of documented, registered in Spain and in Portugal, of course. The Iberian Peninsula is full of mysteries, and of course, in a society, in a culture where people spend so much of their time out of doors in the countryside, and where the nights are very warm. For example, where I'm living nowadays, in the summer it was 45 degrees during the day, and it could still be up to 40 degrees at night. So people are outside a lot. And that means that they have more opportunities to see strange things in the sky. So the thing is, of course, in a country like this, where ufology exists and so does science fiction, but it's not a very big part of the culture, perhaps because of Catholicism, maybe for other factors. So there isn't any general system in place for reporting what you see, for reporting strange things that you see. So, like with meteorites that fall in Africa, something can happen and then nobody will ever find out about it because there's no system in place for registering it.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Let's talk a little bit about your book, and let's pick up on a couple of questions you address in your book. So, first question would be that UFOs are often declared as extraterrestrial crafts.
Mm-hmm.
But in your book, you're asking the question: when did this first happen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the whole reason I wrote this book was that there's a gap in our knowledge, and although many people have brought together cases, stories of pretty ambiguous lights in the sky or encounters with inhuman creatures, most of the time our ancestors would never have called them aliens. They would have called them ghosts or demons or witches or whatever. So I thought, when did we start calling them aliens? And of course, what I did in the book was, firstly, I have this is the Spanish version here, and this is the English version. I began looking back at when we began to believe in the existence of extraterrestrials, because you can't call something that you see in the sky an alien if that isn't a part of what you accept is possible in the universe, particularly if your universe is limited to a single planet, as it has been many times in different cultures in history. Anyway, the ancient Greeks came up with a philosophy called atomism, which the idea was that everything, all material in the world, consisted of tiny atoms, which together created us, wood, metal, stone, and everything else. They were completely right, of course, but they didn't have a microscope to prove it. And they said that what probably happens is that these atoms form the same patterns and the same objects and the same things throughout an infinite universe. So if this is a planet with people and rabbits and trees on it, they were completely sure that we could find the same thing elsewhere in the universe, possibly even in our solar system. So the idea of aliens already existed in ancient Greece. Then what happened was in medieval times, the Catholic Church began to dominate people's views of the cosmos, and they said, no, the only planet that God has ever created is the Earth. So if you see something weird in the sky, it's not from anywhere else. Obviously, it's just they said that comets and meteorites, for example, were what they called exhalations, basically the planet farting, and these were little sparkly things in the sky. So nobody would call them aliens at that point. Then there was a change in the opinion of the leaders of the Catholic Church in the 13th century, and they said, okay, we can't say God wouldn't make another planet with people on it, so let's say maybe he does. And then from that point on, there was a lot of literature and a lot of speculation about extraterrestrials coming from the sky and visiting the Earth. And that's when you start to see, at that point, a little bit of light. People start making connections and thinking, well, we see things in the sky, maybe they're coming from the moon, for example, or maybe they're coming from somewhere else. Even so, we still had to wait until the 18th, 19th century until we saw lots of literature, lots of science fiction about this kind of thing. And then in 1823, something very interesting happened. And that was when the first ancient aliens and ancient astronauts hypothesis was published as a book. In the year 1823, a Frenchman called Francois Chabrier speculated that our ancestors might have come from another planet, and that a lot of our culture might have come from another world and had been imported here by aliens. So it's from 1823 onwards that we see a lot of speculation about, you know, what might be visiting us. In 1857, that's when we find the first UFO report, a book called The Magic Monitor, written by a man called Oliver Brown under the pseudonym of Henry Monette, said that a flying object, a ship, had been seen flying over a village called Jay in Ohio. It was crewed by a number of giant people who were operating machinery. And we don't know what the neighbors thought of it, but the guy who wrote the book, Oliver Brown, said, I think these are interplanetary visitors on a mission, on a scientific mission. They're here either to study us, maybe they're interested in commerce with us. And from that moment on, we find all kinds of stories, claims, fiction, jokes, songs, everything else relating to alien visitors. So in all of that, you have your answer, but it's not a clear-cut one.
Yeah, that's interesting. I talked to this guy. He's a book author from Germany. His name is Axel Ertelt, and he wrote a book about the medieval times, and he mentioned UFO sightings from the medieval times in his book. And always when people experienced strange things in the sky, they always thought it was a sign of God. They described it after what they knew. So it always was some, I don't know, sounds from God and a cross in the sky and a flaming cross in the sky. That's very interesting. But There were UFO sightings in the Middle
So
East.
you have to differentiate between a strange thing people see in the sky and the interpretation that this might have come from another planet. But at the same time, in China and Japan, I believe there was a lot of talk of people coming from other planets and the moon in particular. The moon was always very popular because, of course, it's so big. And using your imagination, you can see like things growing on the moon. You know, the famous man in the moon stories comes from the fact that you can see a face on the surface of the moon. And in China and Japan, that was pretty popular. People were speculating about visiting aliens and things a long time before we did in the West. But I don't have enough information about that. I would love to find Chinese and Japanese ufologists who could talk to me, or not just ufologists, anybody, historians, folklorists, who could tell me something about extraterrestrial beliefs in medieval Asia. But in the 11th century, there was a very famous story called the bamboo cutter about a farmer who finds a tiny girl among the wheat stalks, and he takes her home. And over time, she grows into she becomes the most beautiful woman in Japan. And when she's older, every man in the country wants to marry her, including the emperor. But she says, actually, my family on the moon is going to come and pick me up one of these days, and you won't see me again.
No.
And the emperor says, "Oh, we can beat your family. I mean, we have a powerful army." But when they arrive, they start shooting fiery arrows at her, at the emperor's army. But apart from that, concentrated sunlight, which is practically the same as laser beams, and they defeat the Japanese soldiers extremely well. They take the little, well, the woman now back to the moon, and nobody ever sees her again. But this is the kind of science fiction that was developed in Asia in the 12th century, 11th century. It wouldn't have been possible in Europe because of the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
So of course, with all of this context there, it would be amazing not to find interesting UFO stories.
Great
Yeah.
story. Girl from the Moon. Great story. Never heard about this one. I have to look this one up. Very interesting. Very interesting. Not too long ago, I had the chance to talk to Avi Loeb from the Harvard University, and he told me about Oumuamua. Told me everything he knew about Oumuamua and his plans and so on. Did you follow the story of Oumuamua? What do you think about the story of
To a certain extent. I think that the information is a little bit conflictive still.
Yeah.
I think that there's no hard data to prove that this giant piece of rock or whatever it is behaving particularly strangely. I mean, it's behaving strangely, but whether that means that it's being directed by some intelligence or not, we don't know. What interests me, however, is the fact that in the 21st century, we can become excited by this massive asteroid-like thing in the sky. And if you go back to the beginning of the 19th century, it was asteroids and our discovery of them that led to the creation of the ancient astronaut hypothesis and everything else that came afterwards. So in a sense, it's a little bit like history repeating itself.
Talking about ancient astronauts, ancient aliens. We all know Eric von Däniken. I had the chance to talk to him also in our show. But in your book, you're asking the question, who was the forgotten inventor of the ancient alien theory? Who was it?
Mm-hmm. Well, a few years after the asteroids were discovered, people began to they began to theorize that these chunks had belonged to a planet that had been destroyed. So many scholars reached the conclusion that if it had been a planet, God must have destroyed this planet for a reason. And the only reason why God would destroy a planet would be that it's populated by sinners, by bad, evil people. So there was a theory among philosophers and scholars that the asteroids had belonged to a populated planet, but one populated by evil extraterrestrials. Around the same time, people became very interested in the theory that a comet, if it passed close to the Earth, could cause incredible tidal waves and mass destruction because of gravity and the heat from it and so on. And they began to speculate that maybe this is what had sunk Atlantis in ancient times. Then in around 1818, a man called Francois Chabrier put two and two together and said, well, maybe chunks of that planet that was destroyed landed on Earth, sank Atlantis, but then maybe those pieces of dead planet, shattered planet, were populated, and maybe there were survivors, and perhaps they landed on Earth and started to teach our ancestors about culture and science and so on, and metallurgy and geometry or whatever. So the idea was that possibly our ancestors were either the aliens or they had come into contact with them. He developed this basic theory, which in 1823, which was then taken aboard by a lot of other writers and theorists who went much further than him. So by 1865, we find a man called Baron de Espiard, another Frenchman, who said, and he was a nobleman too, he said that maybe the fossilized dinosaur bones that we find in the ground were actually alien monsters from one of the shattered asteroids. And maybe that explains why we see the fossils of animals that we've never seen in life. And he said, again, maybe the people arrived on our planet on one of those chunks and became our gods. So the man who really invented the ancient astronaut theory, Francois Chabrier, who was born in 1755, he did this in 1820. He published a book in 1823. And this means that next year, it's the 200th anniversary of the ancient aliens theory. And nobody knew until now. So it's something to celebrate. Next time you speak to Eric von Daniken, you can tell him that. I don't know what he'll say.
I will. You should buy some balloons for a celebration.
Balloons, yeah. That'll be a good one. Yeah.
I found the theory with the dinosaur fossils very interesting. What do you think about this theory?
Well, it's interesting that during the 19th century, people had many different ideas about dinosaur fossils. There was the guy who said they were monsters from another planet, but then the Mormons had another idea, it seems. Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormons, said that the Earth had been created from the fragments of other planets by God, who just recycled old planets. And that's why we have dinosaur bones under the ground, because they're just the inhabitants of some alien planet. And so while he was recycling worlds, he just used pieces of planet where that kind of creature had existed. I think it's a very nice, very naive little theory, which came around the same time as Darwinianism, because while Darwin was arguing for the evolution of organic life over extremely long periods, we have this guy here talking about how the fossils came almost immediately as the result of a cataclysm. So people were just using the same evidence to reach very different conclusions.
Mhm.
Then 5 years later, something even weirder happened. Another Frenchman, I don't know why they all had to be French, but the Germans too occasionally came up with some interesting theories. I don't know enough about Germany in the 19th century. I'd love to learn more. But the Dropa, the Dropa and their discs of the Baya Kala Una, or whatever it was called, these mountains
Yeah.
in China. This was a story invented for a magazine about esoteric topics and vegetarianism, published in Germany in the 1960s. It was invented at that point. So you're responsible for that. But the French are responsible for other stuff. 1870, this French guy called Auguste Dufresne presented a thesis, a theory to the Geographical Society in Paris. He said that Australia is such a weird country with flora and fauna and people that don't even seem to be human, that they've probably come from another world. And he came up with a theory that the whole of the Australian continent had fallen into the Pacific Ocean as an asteroid, causing the loss of Atlantis and Noah's flood and so on. And he said that, well, obviously no one's come to reclaim it, the continent of Australia. So it must belong to us now, as if it were a piece of luggage in an airport. And that was his excuse to get rid of the Aborigines and take the land for the white people. So the ancient astronaut theory has a very dark past that we've all forgotten about.
Yeah. Interesting. Very interesting. Do you have a personal UFO story or experience that you could share with us?
On the 6th of April, 1996, I was in Talarrubias in Badajoz with a group of people, I think 6 or 7 people. And we saw a rectangular orange light in the sky. It was almost perfectly rectangular. It wasn't moving. It wasn't going up or down or in any other direction. And it was static in the sky for about 15 minutes around the height of the moon, but it wasn't the moon. And then while we were talking about it, it disappeared. It went out like an electric bulb, and then it reappeared in a completely different part of the sky. So I would say that I'm in the category of UFO witness myself for that reason.
Great. Impressive. Thanks for sharing. It's not always easy for people to share their UFO stories. Some people are ashamed or fear that people could make fun of them. I had an experience also when I was 16. I'm 42 now. When I was 16, I saw, together with 2 friends, I saw a triangle-shaped UFO in the sky. It was very interesting, very intense. It moved very strangely, and it always stuck in my head. It's never forgot about it. It was very interesting. Last question for today would be, since we have a time limit today, in your book, you're asking the question, and this is very interesting because you hear a lot about it. Why do so many encounters involve blonde and blue-eyed beings?
Well, I'm sort of committed in this book to telling the truth to the reader. I mean, I've gone very deep into the origins of ufology. None of this means that UFOs don't exist. None of this means that there aren't some very genuine mysteries out there. But every time I find something, even if it's a bit controversial, I've put it in the book, and there are going to be 3 volumes. So this book just gets to the year 1880. I mean, I got to get all the way up to 1947 at least. One of the things that I noticed was that starting from 1847, which is when we find the first fictional story about an encounter between extraterrestrials and humans. There's this astronomer, he's watching what looks like a comet fall down over Bavaria, again, Germany. And it's two blue lights, two powerful blue electric lights. And actually in 1847, electric blue lights didn't exist yet. But anyway, he sees them come down and float over a garden, his garden. Then suddenly the lights go out, and this man comes out, and this man is blonde, blue eyes, white skin, wearing a very tight uniform, tight clothes, some impossible material for that period. And he communicates with these people using a kind of telepathy. And so this made me wonder why he would come up with the idea of a Nordic extraterrestrial in 1847. We're talking about a time when UFOs didn't exist. The idea of this UFO mythology that we have today, whether they exist or not, this didn't exist at that time. So I began looking into this, and I realized, of course, it's because all of the anthropologists in the first decades of the 19th century believed that superior beings were white-skinned, blue-eyed, with blonde hair. In fact, any textbook, because they taught this at school, said at the time that the most advanced beings on planet Earth and beyond planet Earth were white-skinned, blue-eyed, and looked like Scandinavians. So for many years, people said that if Adam and Eve, and we're talking about that period, no, this is nothing, it seems impossibly new, but 170 years ago, they said if Adam and Eve came from another planet, they were also white-skinned, blue-eyed, and blonde-haired, because they created us, which means, they said, that Black people, Chinese people, Indian people obviously came from other planets, inferior planets. And there was this racism. It was a scientific racism or racialism at the time that was standard. It was so incredibly standard that children were taught this at school. No one doubted it for a very long time. So what we find is that from 1847, when that novel about the UFO comes down was published, onwards, all superior beings were white-skinned, blue-eyed, blonde-haired. And this is a tradition that continues throughout the rest of the century and into the 20th century, where you find George Adamski talking to people from Venus of exactly that description. For example, if you pick up a newspaper from 1880 or 1890 or 1910, whenever there was a theater production about people on the moon, they often had musicals and theater things about people visiting the moon or whatever. It often says with 100 blonde, pretty girls, or with a cast of 50 blonde Martians or whatever chosen from the people living in that area, or actors who had been paid to do this. I imagine they dyed their hair. So the inescapable conclusion is that the whole idea of Nordic aliens has been with us since the beginning of the 19th century, which is it has its roots in a racist idea, which is very sad, but it's also true. But at the same time, and this is the curious thing, when in the 19th century, when they talked about more inferior aliens or weirder aliens, they weren't too different from our modern greys. They weren't too different from sort of genetically deficient beings with very little emotion and who humans couldn't relate to, generally speaking, quite short-statured. So what we begin to see through the 19th century is this sort of dualism in a way of Nordics plus Greys with different names, slightly different descriptions throughout that period, and that survives until the 20th century. Of course, Greys were reinvented again in the early 80s, but the fact is that if you believe strongly in Greys and Nordics as two races who are visiting the Earth, my question is, are you not simply echoing very old racial theories? And if your answer is no, how do you know that you're not? Because these have been reappearing every decade since our great grandparents were born.
Yeah.
You know.
Interesting. Very interesting.
So, yeah, this is the problem. And for example, in 1864, we have here this short-statured fellow in a book. This was in a hoax from 1864 about an alien found inside a giant meteorite. But the fact is that he's also bald and thin and short-statured and so on and so on. Very, very similar to a Grey. In fact, on the very next page, I put a photo of the being seen by Betty Hill and Barney Hill, just so people can see that there is a resemblance there. We haven't reinvented. I mean, we haven't invented anything new. These are very old themes that just keep coming back to us. How much of this is true? How much of this is folklore? That's the real question.
That's the real question. You're right. That's very interesting. Thanks for sharing some of your knowledge with us today. It's very interesting. I encourage everybody to buy your book, Alien Artifacts, The Forgotten Story of How We Came to Believe in Visitors from the Stars. Very interesting read. I like it. I like it. Yeah, like I said, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. I would say stay with me for 2 more minutes. And for everybody else, thank you for listening and watching.